Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for logging in. Thank you for bearing with us. It's nice to see you all here, or imagine that you are there. My name is Michaela Brunberg. I am Head of Arts and Culture at JW3, and it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome you to a very special evening. It's a co-production between Jewish Book Week and JW3. And we're here to mark the UK publication of an extraordinary new book, which is Yaniv Iczkovits' The Slaughterman's Daughter. Jewish Book Week exists beyond their annual festival, and JW3 reaches far beyond the walls of our building, which is now temporarily closed. And you can access arts, culture, classes, along with some exciting upcoming festivals online, all through our new website. And you can also find out how to volunteer and help local communities at this difficult time. So on to tonight. We are very lucky to have Yaniv Iczkovits here dialing in from Tel Aviv, and the chair Rebecca Abrams. Rebecca Abrams is a well-known author and journalist. She teaches creative writing at the University of Oxford, and she's a book critic for the Financial Times. Her own books include The Jewish Journey, 4,000 Years and 22 Objects, which she describes as a short, long history of the Jewish people, and The Prescience Touching Distance, which is an award-winning historical novel based in Aberdeen, telling the story of a deadly epidemic that struck in the 18th century. So let me just tell you how things are going to work. Rebecca and Yaniv are going to chat for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from you. If you want to ask a question, don't feel like you have to hold back for that moment. You can, if you take your cursor, look at the very bottom of your Zoom webinar window, and you'll see it says Q&A. If you click on that, you can type in your question. It won't go to the speakers immediately. It will go through my colleague, Joseph here, and then we will pass it on to the speakers at the time of the questions, and they will call your name, and then you can ask your question verbally. So don't worry if you didn't catch that. I will explain it all when it comes to the questions, but the point is, feel free to ask as we go along by typing. I think that's all. Any technical questions, you can do a private message in the chat box at the very bottom. Chat to Joseph Hyman, who's my colleague. I think he's logged in as JW3 Arts and Culture. You can ask him about the function of how this is working. If you have questions about your own personal internet connection, he is unlikely to be able to help you. So it's just this that he can help you with. And the last thing I want to say before I hand over to our speakers is that our speakers have books which they cannot sign after the event because of this situation, but there is a link where you can buy Yaniv's books, and very soon we'll have the link to Rebecca's books up, and it will be on the Facebook event page and also on our website. So please do click through, buy the books, and this event can keep on going. So at this point, my colleague Joe and I will disappear from your screens, and we will leave you in the hands of Yaniv and Rebecca.
You are on mute.
I'm on mute, okay.
Oh, that's okay now.
Okay. Yaniv Iczkovits, it's a huge pleasure and privilege to be able to talk to you this evening. I'm so happy that we were able to organize this event to go out like this, even if we are separated by many thousands of miles.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to introduce you a little bit to anybody in the audience who doesn't know about your previous work and your background. Yaniv is an award-winning author who taught philosophy, in fact, at the University of Tel Aviv before devoting himself to writing fiction. And all of his fiction has been published to considerable critical acclaim. So he won the Haaretz debut novel prize for his very first book, Pulse. I think Pulse is the right translation. And the Prime Minister's Prize for Hebrew Writers for both his second book, Adam and Sophie, and for his novella, Laws of Inheritance. The Slaughterman's Daughter is Yaniv's third novel. It was published in Israel in 2015 under a different title as Tikkun After Midnight, and we can maybe go back to that in a moment. And it was awarded the Ramat Gan Prize and the Agnon Prize, the first time that the latter prize had been granted in 10 years, a huge honor which reflects kind of what a wonderful book this is. David Grossman described it as a remarkable and evocative read. Gary Shteyngart has called it a necessary antidote for our times. My own favourite description of the book, Yaniv, is Fiddler on the Roof with a splash of Tarantino.
Yes. Yeah.
Shall we just to sort of set the scene a moment? It's set in the Pale of Settlement in the late 19th century, more specifically in a cluster of towns and shtetls in what is now Belarus, and was then part, of course, of the vast Russian Empire. And the protagonist is a young woman called Fanny, who sets out on a perilous journey to find her errant brother-in-law, Tzvi Meir, who has abandoned his wife Menda, who's Fanny's sister, and vanished without trace. And in a nutshell, her journey goes very rapidly from bad to worse. I wondered maybe we should start with you reading a little bit of the book, Yaniv, to just give people a flavour of it.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for your generous presentation, and it's a huge honor to speak with you, Rebecca, and thank you for doing that. And I would also like to thank JW3 and the Jewish Book Week, and also very important, the people of Meckelhaus Press, who were absolutely amazing in publishing this book, Alice and Corina. So I will read a short passage because we are short in time. This is from the third part of the book, page 77. And it tells you a bit about the protagonist of the book, who is Fanny Keismann. And I think she's a unique woman because she sets out to this journey not only to find justice for her sister, but also from a personal devotion to herself, to her freedom, to her desire to break the rules of her society. So it goes like that. The night tightens its grip on Fanny, sinks deep within her, and expands, imbuing her with a sudden realization that she is free. Man was endowed with 5 senses to perceive creation: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And only one sense, the sense of freedom, was granted to creation in order to perceive man. The Shekhinah uses it to examine the human heart and distinguish between servants, masters, and those who are neither one nor the other. And right now, Fanny can feel freedom probing her bones, making her soul sing and her heart throb. She has always suspected that the good God on high is not content with having only the blindly obedient among his believers.
That's a wonderfully evocative kind of passage to have chosen to read, Yaniv. Why did you choose that one in particular, that moment in particular?
Well, because I think that what interests me in Fanny is her ambivalent character. I mean, on the one hand, she feels that her sister was severely damaged and hurt by her husband. So she realizes that if she won't help her, then no one will, because, you know, it's a very kind of the society of men, you know, and all the Orthodox people, they will not help her sister. On the other hand, she also feels that, you know, the world is wrong because people just choose to stay home, you know, and if she won't do it, then, and she has a personal desire to do it herself. And I think that it's interesting because, you know, we mostly feel that we do things for you know, high causes, but there's always a personal kind of interest in that. And what's also interesting is that she's also leaving her family to do that, just like the husband that she's chasing. So it's a complicated character.
The novel actually opens, doesn't it, with a notice placed in the newspaper, right. And then Fanny sort of responds. Well, actually, Menda responds by then. So Fanny's sister then responds by placing an advert of her own. They're there are these posted documents that kind of top and tail and weave their way through the novel, in fact. And I think there's something interesting in there for me about how people present themselves to the outside world and how they experience the world from the inside. And the novel kind of gets at both. I mean, you have the other character who runs alongside Fanny, is Pieton Novak, who's a completely opposite character, but also quite an important figure in the book, isn't he? Really, he's her counterpart, if you like. He's her antagonist, but he's also a very important figure in his own right. And he's somebody who also undergoes a huge transformation in the course of the novel. Could you sort of say a little bit about that character and where he came from?
I think that it's very interesting that you're asking, because Piotr Novak is my character, you know, is the one who is closest to me from all the, because he's a war, he's the baddie, but he's a war hero. He was a devoted officer and soldier, and then he was injured, so he was recruited to the secret police, and he discovered how much corruption the secret police, you know, must handle itself in order to preserve, you know, the order. So I'm very much sympathetic to this character, and also I felt like Jewish literature lacks real Christian characters that are not stereotypic and are not because, you know, when the big Jewish writer in the 19th century, when they depicted Christian characters, there were almost like stereotypic flat characters, and vice versa. You know, Jewish characters were mostly traders, you know, with all the Jewish stereotypics, and I kind of wanted to build a real Russian Christian character with deep sentiment, and his transformation is interesting because he thinks something about the Jewish community, and then he realizes that he has to go into this community. He has to be an agent within this community. And when he gets to know the Jewish community from the inside, he's completely transformed in his view about Jewish people. So,
I mean, for most of the novel, he's tracking Fanny and her companions and trying to find her and capture her. But there is this wonderful scene at the end where he disguises himself as an Orthodox Jew in order to kind of get inside the community, and then gets caught up in this sort of celebration and ends up going along with the whole thing and getting drunk.
The synagogue,
and then it's very funny. And then later, the next day, his own agents don't recognize him. They think he is a Jew, and he's a sort of strange kind of sense in which we kind of we take on these characteristics or these personas, and then they catch up with us and we become them. And there's lots of it. I thought that all of that was very surprising and interesting, in the way that both the Jewish people sort of other the Russians, and then the Russians other the Jews. And there's a sort of a theme running through the book, I felt, in which you're challenging that, because people keep coming up against what people aren't, you know, they're not quite what they expect them to be. I mean, the prime example is Fanny, and we should probably go back to Fanny before we kind of lose sight of her, because she is such a fabulous character. Why? I mean, I think you need to explain, Yaniv, why she is the Slaughterman's daughter and the significance of that.
Well, I think that it's interesting that you're asking, because when I research, you know, the 19th century, I realized that it was a whole different period from what I originally thought about Jewish life in Europe. Because, you know, in Israel, what we mostly focus is the Holocaust, you know, World War II, and all the period that led to World War II. And it's not that before that, you know, Jewish people didn't suffer and they weren't pogroms and anti-Semitism. So these things were real, but for the most part, Jewish people lived in shtetls in which they were 30% of the population, 40% of the population. And the day-to-day routine was pretty much straightforward. You know, they had Christian neighbors. They sometimes celebrated together. They exchanged ideas, trades. I discovered a lot of interesting stories about Christians coming to seek advice with the rabbi because they thought that the priest, you know, is not so smart. And Jewish orchestras playing in Christian weddings. And it was extremely interesting for me because this is not what we learn in Israel about the diaspora, you know. Funny, it was important for me. First of all, it was necessary for me that she will be the daughter of a slaughterman, because in order for her to make the journey, she needed to have some weapon. This is where the idea came from. You know, I realized that the protagonist has to be a woman, and then how would a woman go through the Wild East with all the crooks and robbers without having? So I thought, okay, maybe a man will help her, but then we are back to the same point where men help the women. So she needed to have something. And the only idea I came up with is she might be a daughter of a slaughterman. Now, if she is the daughter of a slaughterman, okay, but Jewish women didn't slaughter, or they weren't supposed to slaughter. So then I came up with a unique woman that as a child, she liked to slaughter. She became fond of her father's profession.
She's fascinated by it, isn't she? She hides in the roof so she can look through the rafters at him while he's at work.
And then I realized that I have to go very far from myself because I'm a vegetarian and I don't like the idea of animal slaughter. But it was a challenge for me as a writer because I wanted to examine the possibility of someone taking pleasure in slaughtering animals. So even though later on she became vegetarian herself, but she was still holding the knife behind her leg, and she knew that someday she will use it on people, not on animals.
And it's a wonderful symbol, the knife as well, because Fanny is I mean, she is a kind of great sort of feminist heroine in many ways, but the knife is so symbolic of her desire to sort of cut through all the things that restrain her, but also all the injustices in the world that she's so outraged by. She's very angry, Fanny, isn't she? Right. I loved her as a character.
She's angry.
So mad at the world.
Well, I think there's a lot of things to be mad at, you know. So because you know, Jewish society at these times, it was so complicated because the world began to open, you know. The Zionists started to raise their head, and a lot of people became fascinating with the secular world and with America, the Golden Medina, and the communists. And so, as a Jew in the end of the 19th century, you kind of realize that Orthodox life is not the only way to live your life. So this is why a lot of husbands just, you know, woke up in the morning and just left their families. You know, it was a very common phenomena in the shtetls. So Fanny was raged by this because you know, you can leave your wife, but at least get a divorce. Don't leave her aguna, as we say in Hebrew. You know,
and this is what she's doing: is she's pursuing Zwei Meyer in order to force him to give her sister a get.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Can I just ask you something about the setting? So it's all set in Belarus, and I think I'm right in saying that isn't an area that you have any sort of personal connections with, that your own family are from other bits of Eastern Europe. So were you familiar with Belarus at all before embarking on this novel, or did you encounter it all through research?
I started to read about the shtetls, and I found some interesting books about this area specifically. I think I chose this area for several reasons. First, I think that before World War II, it was the most, let's say, comfortable area for Jewish people to live in. I mean, the relationship between Christian and Jewish people in this area were perhaps the closest. By the way, in World War II, it completely changed. It's interesting, but before the big war, the relationship between Jewish people and Christians were pretty much close. The second is that Chaim Weizmann was born in this area, and I found it fascinating to write about such a place. And when I read about Motul, which is the city where the plot begins, it was very fascinating to hear about such a small town surrounded by black swamps. You know, you cannot cross the swamps without having a boat or some kind of so I became, and it was very isolated from other Jewish towns. You know, the newspaper used to come like 2 or 3 months after all the Jewish people around you knew about everything. So I became fascinated with this place in a way.
So Fanny is living in Motul at the beginning of the novel,
Yes.
isn't it? She makes this journey from Motul to Minsk,
Yes,
and back again. And as you said, Chaim Weizmann was also born and grew up in Motul. And
right.
Was that just a coincidence, or was that one of the reasons you landed on Motul?
It was a complete coincidence.
Okay.
It was one of the coincidences that you know, I decided about writing about Motul, and then I came up with Chaim Weizmann. These kind of coincidences are always a sign for me that I'm going in the right direction. You must know it as a writer, right? I mean, for example,
it's like when God drops a bit of manna. You
exactly, exactly. When I wrote about the Crimean War, I suddenly encountered Tolstoy, who was present in the Crimean War, and I thought maybe I'll add Tolstoy to the book, but it was too much. But every step, when research and the writing and the plot came together, I was, you know, I realized that I'm going in a good direction. So yeah.
And Fanny says at one point the world cannot be mended because rupture is what makes it go round.
Right.
Does she still have that view at the end of the novel, or is she moving away from that view or towards that view?
It's a great question. The book is called in Hebrew Tikkun, as you know, and Tikkun for me is a very significant term in Judaism. The idea of making amends to yourself, to the world, to your relationship with God, with other people. So I think that without doing any spoilers, there's a very interesting scene in the end when Piotr Novak is meeting Fanny in the towards the end of the book. After everything, you know, after we know what's happening and everything is about to end, and Piotr Novak is arriving to Fanny's house, and he gives her her knife back because he took it back from her after the investigation. And he tells her, I didn't come to arrest you, I came to warn you. And I think that Fanny feels after this journey that it might be the end of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. I think that this journey kind of clarifies it to her. And what she does is, okay, I don't want to tell the end of the book, but she kind of feels that it's not the end of her knife. Even after all, you know, the trails of bodies that she leaves after her, she realizes that it's not the end of the story. So I think this is what she feels. I think there was no way for her to feel that there is a real tikkun for Jewish life in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. It had that slightly reminded me of the Serious Man, the Coen brothers film in that respect.
Right.
And when you at the end, which ends with that huge thunderstorm coming in,
Exactly.
and it had that same feeling. I mean, we should also though make clear to anybody who hasn't read the book yet that it's a very funny novel. You have some absolutely wonderful kind of comic moments in it, and you have the wonderful comic character of the drunken cantor who can't sing, and who's in love with two planks of wood who he calls Olga. Right. I mean, there's a streak of anarchic humor worthy of the Marx Brothers in this novel, which I really enjoyed. And I wondered actually what your who your literary influences or your Jewish cultural influences were in this respect when you were writing the novel, humorous and non-humorous.
Yeah, I don't know how much our audience is familiar with Israeli literature, but when I started to write the book, I had the feeling that Israeli literature has become too heavy. We carry a lot of burden, a lot of even writing in Hebrew. It's I don't know how it is for you to write in English, but I feel that writing in Hebrew carries a lot of weight because on the one hand, it's the biblical language. So, you have every word in Hebrew carries a lot of weight from the biblical language. On the other hand, we have the modern language. Another aspect is we have a lot of issues in Israel. We're constantly at war. The political situation here is very complicated. So every time you try to write in Hebrew, you feel that you carry a lot of weight on your shoulders. So I really wanted to go to a different place. I wanted to. I'm really influenced by the Yiddish, by the great Yiddish writers. Shalom Aleichem, and Mendeley Mocher Sfarim, and Bashevis Zinger, and Agnon, of course, because I think that they came from a very complicated world. I mean, the Jewish world. The end of the 19th century was far from being simple, but they had a sort of comic, humoristic lightness in the writing. And I think that Bashevis Zinger has a great, I always quote him in this aspect. He says that Yiddish is not the language of victory. You cannot go to war in Yiddish. Okay, you cannot storm with your soldiers in Yiddish. Yiddish is a kind of a funny language that is mostly in how you are supposed to accept the world and laugh about the world and get along with what's coming to you, and not necessarily inflicting upon your so I really wanted to create this atmosphere, and I wanted to bring this world to Israel. I didn't know that the book is going to be published in many languages, so I just wanted to bring it to Israel, and to say something to Israeli readers, like, we came from there, and we ended up here. And I wanted them to feel that something happened to us, and maybe to bring this lost world and these lost cultures to Israel, because in Israel we kind of pushed away the Yiddish, pushed away those cultures from the East and from the West and from North Africa, and we kind of tried to create an Israeli, a unified Israeli. And I think that what's interesting is that we can bring those cultures to Israel and celebrate them instead of, repressing them.
That's very interesting. When I was reading it, I was very struck by the register of the language, and how a writer like Agnon in Only Yesterday, he's sort of bringing in that Hebrew biblical language and putting it in a very modern context. In a way, I was interested in the fact that you seem to be doing something quite similar by bringing in this sort of Yiddish inflected world used Yiddish a lot, and there's a lot of Yiddish in the novel.
Right.
And I was wondering about that, what it would be like to read this novel in Hebrew, in Israel and in Hebrew, because the political nature of the register of the language is obviously sort of somewhat lost when you read it in translation in English. I mean, I should say it's a fantastic translation and it reads brilliantly, but the political aspects of what you're talking about with the language, the registers of the language, must be very potent when you read it in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And I think all those references you've talked about, Shalom Aleichem and Besheva Singer. I mean, they're sort of all in there. You can't really write about this world as a Jewish author without sort of invoking the ghosts of these great writers who've gone before. But I wondered how consciously you were aware of them as you were writing, and whether they helped or hindered.
I really tried not to imitate them, because I always felt that if you're gonna write like Shalom Aleichem, you're just gonna fail, because nobody can write like Shalom Aleichem. So I try to melt the old with the new, and I kind of try to do a lot of variations in the book. Like if we have a scene from the army, so I would use a lower aspect of the language, like in Israel, when we have the slang of the army, then we speak a day-to-day slang, and it's a very simple language. And when I go to the shtetl, then I emphasize the Yiddish. And when I go to Piotr Novak, so I remember that when I wrote about Novak, I pulled from my library Gogol and Dostoevsky, and kind of, get the general atmosphere of these great Russian writers. So I think that I kind of got a crazy mix. And after a few pages, it just became natural. I don't know.
There's a lovely scene in which Rochela, who's Fanny's very long-suffering mother-in-law, long but not quietly suffering mother-in-law, she's interrogated, and she basically just answers every question with a kind of stream of more questions.
Yes.
It's a wonderful piece. And I mean, the novel as a whole, I think various reviewers have referred to this as that it's a Russian doll structure. It's sort of stories within stories within stories, and it's quite a baggy book in that sense. One thing leads to another, and then you're in some character's backstory, and it to that extent it resists kind of the idea of a neat sort of narrative momentum. It keeps pulling you in one direction and then taking you in another direction. And I mean, there is at the heart of it this family saga about Fanny and her sister and her sister's husband, but there's also a very political novel in here, isn't there? Because their journey, Fanny's journey, also they get caught by the police, and then they get caught up in the army, and there's a lot of it takes place in the absolute heart of the kind of the Russian army, the Tsarist army. And I thought that was a very interesting aspect of the novel, the sort of satire on sort of incompetent systems and corrupt regimes. And to that extent, were you consciously hoping for a kind of modern resonance to the novel, or was it just came naturally out of the historical material you were dealing with, or both? I don't know.
But that's a great question. When I first started to write it, I had no idea whether it's going to be connected to our present times. But then someone sent me, just by accident, just a friend sent me something that he was irritated about. He sent me a street sign from Mea Shearim. Mea Shearim is a very Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. And he sent me like a street sign of a woman who is crying for her community to seek their help to find her lost husband who left her aguna. And I mean, like in 2014 or 2015. And then I realized that the problem of aguna is still exists in Israel and in the Jewish world. And when I realized that, it was extremely, in the first parts of writing the book, I started to think, wait a second, the secret police and this army and this small family affair that stirs up the whole empire, it's just like in Israel right now. It's just like everywhere in the world. So then I started to get a lot of resonant ideas of the present, and yeah, I think that I was extremely surprised to realize how much it remained the same from the 19th century. And when I went to visit Belarus after writing the book, it was shocking to see how much the shtetls remained the shtetls without the Jews, of course, but you know,
that terrible sense of absence when you go to those places. Yeah. At one point, Fanny and her traveling companions are imprisoned in a military prison, and that, of course, is an experience that you have had yourself. You signed the competence letter refusing to fight in the occupied territories, and I wondered if any of your personal experience of being in a military prison, albeit for a month rather than any longer than that, was quite long enough, I should think. Did any of that experience make it into the novel?
Well, it was such a meaningful experience. I think it will appear in each of my novels, because it kind of affected me as a person. I was like, as you called it in Israel, I was a nice boy from a suburban city near Tel Aviv, you know, and I went to the army. I volunteered to an elite unit in the IDF, and I really liked it. And then when I experienced the service in the occupied territory, something changed in me. And when I refused to serve in the occupied territories, they put me in a military prison for 1 month. And for me, if we set aside the moral issue, it was like taking someone from the mainstream of society and you know, and in just 1 minute, removing him to the outskirts of society, you know, like, you know, you know, people thought I was crazy, that I am, you know, I'm going against my people, that you don't do that in a democratic country. And growing up in such a mainstream environment and family, it was really intense, and it really built my character, and it really influenced my writing, because the book is about people who are outskirts from the center of society, to kind of be, you know, you have Zizek, who was recruited to the army as a child, and then he came back as a kind of a weird person, and you have Fanny, and you have you know, the beggar, and you have lots of people who in one day were just removed to the outskirts of society. So yeah, it's definitely one of the most meaningful experiences in my life.
And it's a very sort of, and as I said, the novel has a lot of humor in it. It has a lot of satire in it, and it can at times it can push you away from kind of empathizing with the characters. But I think the thing that always draws you back into the characters, or for me anyway, is this sense that they have all been sort of had these sort of very random things have happened to them that would completely change the course of their lives, and what a universal experience that is, or how easily that could happen to anybody. And I think for Fanny, she's motivated by this passionate desire for justice, and yet in the end, justice is fundamentally meted out by chance, fate, luck, anything but organized or objective systems of law. And so it sounds from what you're saying as if this is a very important aspect of the book, a sort of a moral aspect of the book that you're exploring.
Yeah, definitely, yes.
I wonder, I'm sure there are lots of people dying to ask you questions, Yaniv, and we have about 20 minutes left. So I wonder if we should give other people a chance to put their questions to you now, and then I can always ask you a few more at the end if there's time.
Sure, I'd be happy.
So I think we've had one question so far, so I'm just going to reiterate how the questions are working so people can feel free. Thank you both so far. This is fascinating. It's just gorgeous to be able to engage with such an exciting book, and also a different time zone.
We all need that. We all need that.
We could all do with some time travel right now.
Yeah.
So for those of you who would like to ask a question, because I know that lots of you are watching on different platforms, Facebook, YouTube, through the Zoom webinar, you just have to type your question. It will get to our speakers, and one by one they'll be answering them. And I think Rebecca, Joe's going to be sending you the first question, which may or may not have arrived.
So the first question is from Sharon Abramson. Are we going to Sharon to ask the question herself, or shall I read it for her? Is Sharon there?
Hi, we'll get Sharon up here in a second.
So
Sharon, we're going to bring.
Sharon, you're going to be promoted to a panelist for a moment, so we'll see you. You can ask your question, and Yaniv can answer it.
Me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not showing my video because I'm not respectable. Let me just go to the question again. First of all, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
I'm actually calling in from Sweden. Now you've made me a panelist, I can't see my question, so I just have to ask it from how I remember it. You mentioned that there were Yiddish words. I was wondering if you explain the words during the book, or if you have a word list at the back of the book. And the part you read, you said the word Shehina. There are many people and non-Jewish people that wouldn't understand that word. I personally don't speak Yiddish. I know what the Shehina is, but I was wondering if there's some sort of word list at the back of the book for all of these words.
Well, there are not many words in Yiddish, and like the Shechina, but I chose not to have, you know, like a list of words or something like that, because I felt that I don't like it when I read books. I try to understand it from the context. So my choice, they offered me, even in Hebrew, by the way. And I said, well, you know what? A bit of strange words is something that I like in books.
Okay, but they're not so many then that it would be.
No.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Welcome.
So we have another question from Rabbi Amanda Golby. Amanda, are we coming to you?
Sorry, can you now hear me? I've only read about 100 pages so far, and have very much enjoyed it, and was very aware of feeling like I was reading Singer and the other influences. And I was wondering what of the religious nature reflects either your upbringing or that of family members. And you just spoke that you didn't know Agnon still happened in Israel. Just a bit of information about that, please.
Thank you for the question. My grandparents, we come from a religious family. My grandparents were religious. From my father's side, we come from a very well-known place called Satu Mare, which was the origin of the great Orthodox, the rabbi from Lubavitch, the whole Brooklyn thing. So it comes from Satu Mare, and my grandparents were religious, even though they weren't extremely Orthodox. So I think that my parents are traditional and not religious. Like every generation, we become more and more secular. I'm completely secular, but I do some of the traditional, I do the holidays and stuff like that. But there's a very interesting thing that Wittgenstein said, and I very much sympathize with it. And it is, I'm not a religious man, but I see every problem from a religious point of view. So I would kind of say that this sentence summarized my view of religion.
Thank you. And
Welcome.
certainly it felt very much that you had to have some sort of real background and it wasn't just research, whatever you now practice. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got two questions which you can choose from, if you can see them, Rebecca.
So, so there's a question from Sue Walsh. Shall I read that one? Would you like me to read that question, or we can?
I think we can go to her. Oh, I wonder. Oh, she's here. I think yes, here she is. Sue Walsh, are you there?
Yes, sorry. Hang on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm actually in Canada and very interested to read about this book. Hopefully you'll come here one day. I'm interested in the research you had to do for the book. And also I've only just started it. You talk in, you use different people like as protagonists. And could you comment on why you like that as a format?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the research was a huge headache. I mean, I was lucky to be in Columbia University at that time because the resources there were much more meaningful than what I had in Israel. I started from reading a lot of books, and I felt that my time is just being spent on reading a lot of books. I was reading 400 pages for only a short passage from. So I learned that the most important thing in your research is to find the right books. You don't need to read more than 3-4 books in order. So what I was searching for is books that are not about the big issues and the big principles, but about the small stories. And there aren't history. For example, I wrote a lot about the Crimean War. So if you Google the Crimean War, you will get 100 books about generals, moving forces and stuff like that, and the mistakes they did. And what I was interested was in the soldiers in the trenches, so. And there aren't a lot of books about simple soldiers in the Crimean War. So when I found 1 or 2 like that, it was enough for me. So I kind of learned how to do the correct research as I wrote the book. But I think that I used to maybe write for 1 month and research for 4 months, something like that. This was the time allocation. Regarding your second questions, I didn't plan the book to have a lot of protagonists. I kind of planned a journey for Fanny, the protagonist, and her companion, Zizek. And I knew that there's gonna be an inspector from the police, but he kind of grew up as I began to write the novel. He became more and more important to me. And other characters on the way, I didn't plan them to play such an important role. By the way, the book, I don't know how many pages in English, but in Hebrew it was 500 pages, and I wrote 800 pages. So I had to cut 800 pages to 500 pages. So I kind of I was carried away with the story.
Does that mean we get part 2? Do we get a sequel?
I don't think so. I kind of got carried away with the story, and when I started to do the editing, so I really needed to focus and realize, what I'm dropping off the story. So a lot of parts from the book weren't planned.
With historical fiction, that's always quite an issue, isn't it? Is how to balance the historical research with the actual story that you're trying to tell, not to let the fictional world be completely crushed by the historical world.
Exactly.
Rebecca, I was interested in your approach to historical fiction and how you marry the research with the writing part.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing. It's trying to get that balance. So you have to do the research. I don't know if you found this, Yaniv, as well, but you have to know so much before you can make your characters even get out of bed and cross the room. Yes. And yet, you can kill the story dead if the historical research is too heavy. It has to be so plowed in. And I did think that the attention to detail was beautifully managed in this book. Is that you did really sort of give it a very, very vivid sense. It occurred to me while you were talking, of course, that Eva Hoffman's wonderful book Shtetl is set in Belarus as well. Was that a big influence for you when you were writing?
Eva Hoffman, I'm in love with her. Everything she writes, I think she's such a great author. She's such an inspiration. She has this other book, I don't remember, Lost in something.
Lost in Translation.
Exactly, Lost in Translation, which is also such a wonderful book. And yeah, as you say, you are being exposed to so many stories and you want to share so much. But you have to remind yourself that this is not a book about history. This is not, you are not teaching someone about the historical period. You want to tell a story. So yeah, you probably know it better than me, Rebecca, that it's a delicate issue in writing.
There are some couple of more questions coming through for you. One about Yiddish and one about how your book was received in Israel. I mean, should we go to Ingrid Rockberger first? She can ask that question.
Sure.
Is Ingrid there? Yeah, she is.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Hi, Yaniv. Very pleased to meet you. I'm sitting in Ra'anana in Israel. I'm very interested to know how your book was received here, because I sort of agreed with you so much where I immediately identified when you said that general contemporary Hebrew literature here is very heavy. And very often I start some books here and I push them away. I just can't be bothered because they are too heavy and there's so much more in the country.
Right.
So, how was it received here? Especially all the things in it that you said were relevant to life in Israel, including your military imprisonment.
Right. Well, I always say that when the Jewish people immigrated to Israel, they left the humor in Europe. And then it immigrated, to Western Europe and to America, people like Philip Roth and, and Seinfeld and Woody Allen. So I thought that nobody is going to publish the book in Israel, to be honest. When I sent it to my publisher in Israel, I thought that I'm going to get a very, let's say, serious phone call. And I didn't think that anyone will be interested in this kind of book, because when you write about something else in Israel, they always blame you that you are neglecting your responsibility as a writer, because Israeli writers, like Amos Oz, and before that, Samech Izar, if you know, and they were like the prophets, they like their stories were a symbol of Israel, and I really thought that they are not going to publish it, but I was surprised. I was really surprised because first of all, they immediately liked the idea, and they even paid me an advance, which is extremely rare in Israel. And I remember my editor saying me, look, I want this book, tell me whatever you want and we'll publish it. So I was surprised. In the beginning, I don't think that the Israeli audience realized what's going on. Like, people bought the book and they read it and they didn't quite know how to respond. but then it got some critical acclaim and it won some prizes. So I think that it pushed it more and more into people's awareness. And when it was translated to other language, so it also helped. You know, Israel is like very much when people are successful abroad. You know, we always feel that the most important thing are happening in the UK and the US. So everything, when we hear something like that, it's like a sign of success. So I think that I was really surprised.
It's very interesting. It's a very interesting question that about the reception in Israel, isn't it? Because as well, in a way, your book has two quite distinct audiences. I mean, it's a book which is it's a diaspora. It's a book about the Jewish world of the diaspora. So those of us who aren't in Israel, we read it still in the diaspora.
Right.
For the Israeli audience, of course, it's quite a different. The whole lens through which they're looking at the book is quite different. Are you aware of that now that the book is coming out in other countries, that it is being received?
Yeah, I was actually surprised when my agent told me that a lot of countries are interested. I asked myself, why should the Chinese or the Italians or, you know, even people in the UK, why should they be interested in a story about Shtetl life? And so yeah, and even in Israel, I got some negative responses from people who said, okay, so what's your point? Are you saying that that Jewish life in the Shtetls were great, were amazing? Maybe the state of Israel, you know? So yeah, you know, I kind of I don't know how to react to these kind of responses, but I do know, and someone explained it to me. I mean, I'm reading books from Japan, I'm reading books from the UK, not necessarily by Jewish writers, by the way, and I'm very much interested in the stories. So yeah, people are interested in stories that are not from here and are not necessarily about now. And I think that this is what literature is all about, you know. So there shouldn't be a difference in this sense.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question. There's a question from Baruria Vigand. I don't know if that's how I pronounced, whether I pronounced your name right. I apologize if not. Are you still there, Baruria? Not sure. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Hi, I'm a lecturer in Yiddish at the University of Oxford. I was wondering whether you actually know Yiddish yourself or have checked with Yiddishists in Israel or internationally about the Yiddish expressions. Unfortunately, I haven't read the Hebrew original and seen how the Yiddish is there in the Hebrew original, but in the English translation, the transliterations are absolutely terrible, very, very Germanic and full of grammatical mistakes, which is really a shame because the novel is really wonderful and it detracts from the beautiful novel.
Well, I don't know Yiddish. I mean, I know some from home, and I know, you know, the general Yiddish flavor to the Hebrew. We use a lot of Yiddish in Hebrew. A lot of words in Hebrew are taken from Yiddish. But I've worked with one of the world's leading Yiddish experts, who is Professor David Asaf, who wrote did a lot of translations from Yiddish, and who is well known for his translations. So he kind of helped me to get through the Yiddish, and he also minimized the use of Yiddish words in the book. He told me, look, you don't need so much Yiddish words, okay? This is a book in Hebrew. A bit of Yiddish words here and then are okay, but, you know, okay, we realized they used to speak Yiddish, but even if you have one Yiddish word every 50 pages, it's okay. So I've worked with him very closely, and I really appreciate his work. And I also appreciate Orr Scharf, who is the brilliant translator of the book, and I'm really grateful for his work. But you're the expert, so I guess I can't argue with you about the mistakes.
So I'm afraid to say it is now 9 o'clock and we have used up all our time. But I just wanted to thank you, Yaniv Iczkovits, very, very much for your time this evening and for talking about your fantastic book, which is just has so much to say about so many different things. And I'm actually rather looking forward to rereading it now in the light of our conversation. And thank you to everybody at JW3, and
I want to thank you, Rebecca, sincerely for participating and taking the time and reading the book with a sensitive, such a sensitive reading. So thank you very much. Really, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. It's been just such a gorgeous conversation, completely fascinating. And to all our participants on all the different fields. And I love it. We've had questions from Canada and Sweden and Israel, and who knows how far the audience has reached. I'm sorry, Yaniv, that you couldn't make it over here. Next time, we'll get you coffee, we'll get you cake, it'll be lovely. And we'll see you next time. And for everybody who is watching, can I say that our participants have very, very generously donated their time, and you are able to watch this for free, and that's great, but you also have the option of donating. And so there is a button when you register for your ticket, and you can donate, and any proceeds made will be split 50-50 between Jewish Book Week and JW3, and ensure that we can continue during this difficult time. So thank you once again for a completely riveting chat, Yaniv and Rebecca.
Thank you. Thank you.
And
really, and I hope you're all well and safe in the UK, and that you'll get through this very fast.
And feel free to linger to chat with each other. If Yaniv and Rebecca don't have to rush off, they might be able to answer any more questions, which you can type in the chat box. So, we're hanging out for another 10 minutes or so, so feel free to linger. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you very much.